What if I told you that one of the most powerful figures in American justice could fall from grace in a single afternoon, only to discover that their greatest enemy had been secretly protecting them all along? What if that same person, after losing everything, would go on to change the lives of thousands who had been forgotten by the very system they once served? This is the story of Justice Marcus Wellington, a man who thought he knew everything about power, loyalty, and the price of standing alone. But sometimes the people we dismiss, the voices we silence, and the hands we refuse to shake are the very ones holding the threads that keep our world from unraveling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The marble corridors of the Supreme Court building had never felt colder than they did on that Tuesday morning in late October. Justice Marcus Wellington adjusted his black robes as he walked toward the courtroom, his footsteps echoing with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. At 62, Marcus had spent the last 18 years on the highest court in the land, making decisions that shaped the lives of millions. His opinions were sharp, his dissents legendary, and his reputation for intellectual rigor unmatched. But Marcus Wellington carried a secret that would have shocked his colleagues and devastated his supporters. Behind the facade of judicial excellence lay a man slowly drowning in a tide of corruption that had begun so subtly, so gradually, that he barely noticed when the water reached his neck. It started 5 years ago with a seemingly innocent dinner invitation from Jonathan Blackwell, a prominent Washington lobbyist with connections that ran deeper than the Potomac River. The invitation came at a time when Marcus was struggling with his mother's mounting medical bills, costs that his judicial salary couldn't quite cover. His mother, Eleanor Wellington, had been his inspiration to pursue law, a civil rights activist who had fought for justice in the segregated South when such fights could cost you everything. The dinner led to a second meeting, then a third. Jonathan never asked for anything directly. Instead, he spoke in possibilities, in theoretical scenarios, in hypothetical cases that might someday reach the Supreme Court. He mentioned offshore accounts, speaking fees that could be arranged through shell corporations, book deals that could be structured to avoid scrutiny. Marcus told himself he was just listening, just being polite to a constituent who wanted to understand the judicial process better. The first payment came disguised as a consulting fee for a legal review that Marcus never actually performed. $25,000 deposited into an account in the Cayman Islands that Jonathan had helped him establish. Marcus stared at the bank statement for hours, knowing he had crossed a line, but unable to bring himself to return the money. His mother needed a new treatment that insurance wouldn't cover, an experimental therapy that cost exactly $25,000. That was how it began. One compromise leading to another, each payment seemingly justified by some pressing need, some family emergency, some opportunity that would never come again. Within 2 years, Marcus Wellington had accepted over $300,000 in hidden payments, all carefully structured to avoid detection, all tied to cases that had come before the court. But Marcus wasn't the only one walking those marble halls with secrets. Attorney General Patricia Bondi had been watching, waiting, gathering evidence with the patience of a hunter who knew that the biggest prey required the longest stalks. Patricia had built her career on bringing down powerful men who thought themselves untouchable. She had toppled senators, destroyed governors, and sent cabinet members to prison. A Supreme Court justice would be her masterpiece. What Marcus didn't know was that Patricia's investigation had begun not from suspicion, but from an anonymous tip that had arrived in her office 18 months earlier. A simple manila envelope containing bank records, photograph evidence, and a note written in careful block letters that read, "Justice is supposed to be blind, not bought." The envelope bore no return address, no fingerprints that could be traced, no DNA evidence that could reveal its source. Patricia had spent months verifying the information, building her case piece by piece, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She knew that taking down a Supreme Court justice would require evidence so overwhelming, so irrefutable, that even Marcus's most ardent defenders would have no choice but to abandon him. That perfect moment came during the oral arguments for Morrison versus United States, a case involving corporate liability that had captured national attention. Marcus had already received his final payment from Jonathan Blackwell, $50,000, to ensure that his vote would favor the corporate defendants. The payment had been made just 72 hours before the arguments began, transferred through a series of shell companies that Patricia's team had been monitoring for months. As Marcus took his seat that morning, he felt the familiar weight of compromise pressing down on his shoulders. He told himself this would be the last time that after this case, he would find a way to extricate himself from Jonathan's web. He had been telling himself the same lie for 3 years. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal scholars, and representatives from both sides of the case. The corporate defendants had hired the most expensive legal team in Washington, while the plaintiffs were represented by a small firm that specialized in environmental justice. Marcus looked down at the attorneys below and felt a familiar pang of guilt. Once he had been like them, fighting for causes he believed in, taking cases that mattered more than the money they brought. Patricia Bondi sat in the gallery, her presence unusual enough to draw whispered speculation from the press corps. Attorneys general rarely attended Supreme Court arguments unless the federal government was directly involved in the case. But Patricia had her reasons for being there, reasons that would become clear before the day was over. The arguments proceeded normally for the first hour. The corporate attorneys presented their case with polished efficiency, arguing that their clients couldn't be held liable for environmental damage that had occurred decades earlier under different ownership. The plaintiffs' attorneys countered with passionate appeals to justice and corporate responsibility, their voices carrying the weight of communities that had been poisoned by decades of industrial negligence. Marcus found himself genuinely torn as he listened to the arguments. The legal scholar in him recognized the validity of both sides' positions. The corruption that had consumed him hadn't destroyed his ability to understand the law. It had simply made it impossible for him to apply it fairly. He knew which way he would vote, knew which way he had already been paid to vote, but hearing the plaintiff's attorneys describe the cancer clusters, the birth defects, the families torn apart by corporate greed, made him question everything he had become. During the lunch recess, Marcus retreated to his chambers, hoping to find some peace in the familiar surroundings of his private office. The walls were lined with law books, awards, and photographs from his confirmation hearing 18 years earlier. In one photo, he stood beside his mother, both of them beaming, with pride and hope for the future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor Wellington had died 2 years ago. Her experimental treatments ultimately unsuccessful, despite the money Marcus had sacrificed his integrity to obtain. A soft knock on his door interrupted his brooding. Marcus expected to see one of his clerks, but instead found himself facing Patricia Bondi. She entered without waiting for an invitation, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying the intensity of a prosecutor who had spent months preparing for this moment. "Justice Wellington," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I think it's time we had a conversation." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Patricia's presence in his chambers could mean only one thing, but he forced himself to maintain the composure that had served him well during 18 years on the bench. Attorney General Bondi, this is unexpected. I wasn't aware we had any business to discuss. Patricia opened the leather portfolio she carried and placed a photograph on Marcus's desk. It showed him shaking hands with Jonathan Blackwell outside a restaurant in Georgetown, the same restaurant where they had discussed the Morrison case just 1 week earlier. I think we have quite a bit to discuss, actually. More photographs followed. Marcus entering a building that housed the Cayman Islands Bank where his secret account was held. Marcus signing documents at a law office that served as a front for Jonathan's money laundering operations. Marcus accepting an envelope from Jonathan in what he had thought was a private parking garage. 5 years, Patricia said quietly. 5 years of evidence, 5 years of payments, 5 years of corrupting the highest court in the land. Did you really think no one would notice? Marcus stared at the photographs, his mind racing through possible explanations, potential defenses, ways to minimize the damage. But the evidence was overwhelming, the trail too clear to deny. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want justice," Patricia replied. "The same justice you swore to uphold when you took your oath of office. The same justice you've been selling to the highest bidder for the past 5 years. You don't understand the pressures," Marcus began, but Patricia cut him off with a gesture. "I understand perfectly. I understand that you accepted over $400,000 in bribes. I understand that you voted in favor of defendants. Who paid for your vote? I understand that you perverted the very institution you were sworn to protect." Patricia's voice remained calm, but her words cut like surgical instruments. "What I don't understand is how you thought you would never be caught." Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of 18 years of judicial authority, slipping away like sand through his fingers. "How long have you known?" "Longer than you might think. But that's not what matters now. What matters is what happens next." Patricia placed another document on the desk, this one bearing the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Arrest warrant for Justice Marcus Wellington. Charges including bribery, conspiracy, money laundering, and corruption of federal judicial proceedings. The words seemed to echo in the small chamber, bouncing off the law books and awards that had once represented everything Marcus thought he stood for. He had always known this moment might come, had nightmares about it for years, but the reality was somehow both worse and more anticlimactic than he had imagined. "When?" he asked. "Now." Patricia checked her watch. "The afternoon session begins. In 20 minutes, you'll be arrested in open court, in front of the press, in front of your colleagues, in front of the American people who trusted you to be better than this." Marcus felt something break inside him, not his spirit exactly, but some fundamental belief in his own ability to control his destiny. For 18 years, he had been one of the 9 most powerful people in America, his decisions carrying the weight of law, his words shaping the course of justice. Now he was just another corrupt official waiting for the handcuffs to click into place. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Why not just have me arrested without warning?" Patricia studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since entering his chambers, her expression softened slightly. "Because someone asked me to give you a chance to maintain whatever dignity you have left. Someone who believed that even after everything you've done, you deserved to hear the truth before the world came crashing down." "Who?" Marcus asked, though he couldn't imagine who would show him such consideration. "Someone who has been watching over you longer than you know. Someone who tried to warn you, tried to save you from yourself, but couldn't reach you in time." Patricia gathered her photographs and documents, sliding them back into her portfolio. "You'll meet them soon enough." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, Justice Wellington, I remember the lawyer you used to be. The one who fought for civil rights, who stood up for the powerless, who believed that justice was more than just a word carved in marble. That man would have been disgusted by what you became. After Patricia left, Marcus sat alone in his chambers, surrounded by the artifacts of a career that was about to end in handcuffs and headlines. He thought about his mother, about the idealism that had driven him to law school, about the oath he had taken 18 years ago to support and defend the Constitution. He thought about the families who would suffer because of his corrupted votes, the justice that had been denied because he had been too weak to resist temptation. A second knock came at his door. This time it was his senior clerk, a brilliant young woman named Sarah Chen, who had clerked for him for 2 years. Her face was pale, her usual composure shattered by whatever news she carried. "Justice Wellington," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are FBI agents in the courthouse. They're asking for you." Marcus nodded, straightening his robes one final time. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything. You've been an exceptional clerk, and I hope this doesn't taint your future in the law." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she maintained her professional composure. "Sir, I don't understand. What's happening? You will soon enough. And when you do, remember that the law is bigger than any one person, bigger than any one mistake. Don't let my failures destroy your faith in justice." Marcus walked through the marble corridors one last time, his footsteps echoing differently, now carrying the weight of disgrace rather than authority. The afternoon session was already underway when he entered the courtroom, and the sight of FBI agents positioned near the exits sent a ripple of confusion through the gallery. Chief Justice Robert Harrison looked up as Marcus took his seat, confusion evident in his expression. The other justices noticed the unusual atmosphere, the tension that seemed to fill the air like static electricity before a storm. Patricia, Bondi had returned to her seat in the gallery, and Marcus could feel her eyes on him as the attorneys continued their arguments. He tried to focus on the legal issues being discussed, tried to lose himself in the intellectual exercise that had once brought him such satisfaction. But the words seemed to blur together, meaningless syllables that couldn't compete with the certainty of his impending arrest. The moment came during a particularly passionate argument from the plaintiff's attorney, a young woman who was describing the health effects of industrial pollution on children in her community. Marcus found himself genuinely moved by her words, reminded of why he had wanted to be a judge in the first place. It was then that Patricia Bondi stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the attorney's argument like a blade. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have urgent business that cannot wait." Chief Justice Harrison frowned, clearly irritated by the breach of protocol. "Attorney General Bondi, this is highly irregular. We're in the middle of oral arguments. I understand, Your Honor, but this matter directly concerns the integrity of these proceedings." Patricia moved toward the bench, FBI agents flanking her on either side. "I have evidence of judicial corruption that requires immediate action." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Reporters reached for their phones. Attorneys turned to each other in bewilderment, and the other justices stared in shock as the reality of the situation began to dawn on them. Patricia placed a document on the bench in front of Chief Justice Harrison, a federal arrest warrant for Justice Marcus Wellington on charges of bribery, conspiracy, and corruption of federal judicial proceedings. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from an explosion. Marcus felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward him, felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. In all the years of the Supreme Court's existence, no sitting justice had ever been arrested in open court. "Justice Wellington," Chief Justice Harrison said, his voice heavy with disbelief and sorrow. "Do you have anything to say?" Marcus stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath his robes. He looked out at the packed courtroom, at the reporters who would carry this story to the world, at the attorneys whose faith in the judicial system was being shattered before their eyes. He thought about the words he could say, the defenses. He could offer the explanations that might soften the blow. Instead, he chose honesty. "I have disgraced this institution and betrayed the trust of the American people," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I accepted bribes, I corrupted judicial proceedings, and I violated every principle I swore to uphold. I offer no excuses and ask for no mercy. I deserve whatever consequences await me." The FBI agents moved forward then, and Marcus extended his hands without resistance. The click of handcuffs echoed through the courtroom like the final gavel, in a case that would change American jurisprudence forever. As he was led away, Marcus caught sight of Patricia Bondi, watching from the gallery, her expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting that this moment brought her no joy. The media explosion that followed was unlike anything Washington had seen in decades. Within hours, Justice Marcus Wellington's arrest was leading every news broadcast, dominating social media, and sparking debates about judicial ethics that would continue for months. The Supreme Court suspended all proceedings pending a full investigation, and calls for Marcus's impeachment began before he had even been processed at the federal detention center. But even as Marcus sat in a holding cell, stripped of his robes and his authority, he couldn't shake Patricia Bondi's words about someone who had been watching over him, someone who had tried to save him from himself. As the reality of his situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket, Marcus found himself wondering who could possibly have cared enough about his fate to intervene, and why their efforts had come too late to prevent his fall from grace. The answer to that question would prove to be the most shocking revelation in a story already full of surprises, a twist that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of justice. But that revelation would have to wait until tomorrow, when Marcus would discover that his greatest enemy had been secretly protecting him all along, and that his fall from grace was just the beginning of a journey that would lead him to a purpose greater than any he had ever imagined. In his cell that night, as Marcus stared at the concrete walls that had replaced his mahogany chambers, he had no way of knowing that his arrest was not the end of his story, but merely the end of the first chapter. The real story, the one that would transform him from a corrupt judge into something far more valuable, was just beginning to unfold. The federal detention center in Alexandria, Virginia, had housed many powerful men who had fallen from grace, but none quite like Marcus Wellington. Former senators, cabinet members, and CEOs had walked these corridors before him, but a sitting Supreme Court justice was unprecedented. The other inmates gave him a wide berth, uncertain how to interact with someone who had wielded such extraordinary power just days before. Marcus spent his first 3 days in solitary confinement, not as punishment, but for his own protection. The warden, a career corrections officer named David Torres, had seen enough high-profile prisoners to know that Marcus would be a target. Some inmates would see attacking a Supreme Court justice as the ultimate badge of honor, while others would simply resent everything he represented. During those long hours alone in his cell, Marcus replayed every decision that had led him to this moment. The conversations with Jonathan Blackwell seemed like scenes from someone else's life, viewed through a lens of perspective that made his choices appear both inevitable and utterly foolish. He had told himself so many lies over the years that he had almost convinced himself they were true. Almost. The attorney who came to see him on the 4th day was not who Marcus expected. Instead of the high-powered defense lawyer he assumed his family would hire, he found himself facing a middle-aged, black woman with graying hair and kind eyes. She introduced herself as Monica Williams, and her credentials were impressive but puzzling. She had spent 20 years as a public defender before opening a small practice that specialized in representing fallen public officials who couldn't afford elite legal representation. "I don't understand," Marcus said as they sat across from each other in the sterile conference room. "Who hired you? How are you being paid?" Monica smiled, an expression that seemed genuine despite the circumstances. "Those are interesting questions, Justice Wellington. The retainer was paid in full 3 months ago by a trust that wishes to remain anonymous. The instructions were very specific. If you were ever arrested, I was to represent you regardless of the charges, and I was to focus not on getting you off, but on helping you understand what comes next." What comes next? Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. What does that mean? It means someone has been planning for this day for a very long time. Someone who knew this moment would come and wanted to ensure you had guidance when it did. Monica opened a thick folder and spread several documents across the table. "Your benefactor left very detailed instructions about your defense strategy, your plea negotiations, and most importantly, your future." Marcus stared at the documents, recognizing some of the bank records and communication transcripts from his meetings with Jonathan Blackwell, but there were other papers he had never seen before, internal memos from the Department of Justice, FBI surveillance reports, and what appeared to be a complete timeline of Patricia Bondi's investigation. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "How could anyone have known so much about what was happening?" "The better question," Monica replied, "is why someone who clearly had access to all this information didn't use it to stop you before you fell so far. Why they chose to document your destruction rather than prevent it." Over the next hour, Monica walked Marcus through the evidence that would be presented at his trial. The prosecution's case was airtight, built on financial records, recorded conversations, and photographic evidence that left no room for denial. But what struck Marcus most forcefully was how much additional evidence existed that hadn't been turned over to prosecutors. Someone had been watching him far more closely than even Patricia Bondi realized. "Who is it?" Marcus asked finally. "Who has been collecting all this information?" Monica closed the folder and studied Marcus carefully. "Someone who tried to save you from yourself and failed. Someone who watched you make choice after choice that led you away from everything you once stood for. Someone who cared enough about the man you used to be to document every step of your fall." "That doesn't answer my question." "No, it doesn't. Because I've been instructed not to reveal their identity until you're ready to hear it, until you've accepted full responsibility for what you've done and are prepared to face the consequences without looking for someone else to blame." Marcus felt a flash of his old judicial arrogance. "I'm not looking for someone to blame. I know what I did. Do you? Because from where I sit, you seem more concerned with who was watching you than with who you hurt. You're asking about your mysterious benefactor instead of asking about the families whose cases you corrupted, the justice you denied, the institution you damaged." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Monica was right, and he knew it. Even in his disgrace, even facing federal charges and the end of his career, his first instinct was still to think about himself rather than the victims of his corruption. "Tell me about them," he said quietly. "Tell me about the people I hurt." Monica opened another folder, this one containing case summaries and impact statements. For the next 2 hours, she walked Marcus through the human cost of his corrupted decisions. There was the environmental case where his vote had allowed a chemical company to avoid cleanup costs, leaving a community to deal with contaminated water for another decade. The employment discrimination case, where his opinion had made it harder for workers to prove systemic bias. The criminal justice case, where his interpretation of sentencing guidelines had kept non-violent offenders in prison longer. Each case represented real people whose lives had been affected by his choices. Marcus had always known this intellectually, but hearing the specific details made the abstract consequences devastatingly concrete. A mother whose child had developed cancer from contaminated drinking water. A woman who had been passed over for promotion because of her race, but couldn't prove it in court, thanks to Marcus's narrow interpretation of discrimination law. A young man who had spent 3 additional years in prison because of a sentencing decision that favored prosecutors over defendants. "I need to make this right," Marcus said when Monica finished. "There has to be something I can do." "There might be, but first, you need to accept that making it right doesn't mean getting your old life back. It means building something entirely new from the wreckage of what you destroyed." That night, alone in his cell, Marcus wrote letters he knew he would never send. Letters to the families affected by his decisions. Letters to his former colleagues on the Supreme Court. Letters to law students who had once looked up to him as an example of judicial excellence. In each letter, he tried to articulate an apology that felt adequate to the magnitude of his betrayal. None of them came close. The plea negotiations began the following week, with Monica representing Marcus in discussions with Patricia Bondi's prosecution team. The government's offer was harsh but fair. Marcus would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommendation of 15 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole, no special treatment because of his former position, but also no additional charges beyond those already filed. They could ask for much more, Monica explained. Justice corruption cases typically result in sentences of 20 to 25 years. Someone is advocating for you behind the scenes. Patricia Bondi. Unlikely. She's built her career on putting people like you away for as long as possible. This recommendation came from higher up, from someone with enough influence to modify the government's typical approach. Marcus was beginning to understand that forces beyond his comprehension were shaping his fate. The mysterious benefactor who had hired Monica, the lenient plea recommendation, the careful timing of his arrest, all of it suggested a level of orchestration that went far beyond a simple corruption investigation. The answer came from an unexpected source. During his second week in detention, Marcus received a visitor he hadn't expected, his former clerk, Sarah Chen. She looked older than her 28 years, worn down by the stress of working for a Supreme Court justice who had been arrested for corruption. The media attention had been brutal, with reporters questioning whether the clerks had known about Marcus's activities. "I'm so sorry," were the first words out of Marcus's mouth when Sarah sat down across from him. "For what? For destroying my faith in the judicial system? For making me question whether anything I believed about justice was real? For turning me into a footnote in the biggest Supreme Court scandal in history?" Sarah's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the pain in her eyes. "Yes, for all of that and more. You deserved better." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "Do you want to know the truth about what really happened? About who turned you in?" Marcus felt his heart stop. "You? No. But I know who did. And I know why." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope identical to the one Patricia Bondi had described receiving 18 months earlier. "This was left on my desk 6 months ago. No note, no explanation, just bank records and photographs documenting your corruption." Marcus stared at the envelope, his mind racing. "Why didn't you report it immediately?" "Because the person who left it also left instructions. They wanted me to understand the full scope of what was happening before I made any decisions. They wanted me to see how deep the corruption went, how many cases had been affected, how many people had been hurt. Who was it? Sarah reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a photograph. It showed Marcus shaking hands with Jonathan Blackwell, but this time Marcus recognized the location. It was taken outside the courthouse 3 years ago during one of their early meetings. But what caught his attention wasn't the handshake or the location. It was the reflection in the window behind them. The face of someone who had been watching from inside the building. The face belonged to Elena Rodriguez, Marcus's former clerk from 12 years ago. Elena had been one of the most brilliant legal minds Marcus had ever encountered. A young woman who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School and seemed destined for a Supreme Court clerkship. But her time working for Marcus had ended abruptly when she had discovered evidence of ethical violations involving gifts from lawyers who practiced before the court. Marcus had managed to cover up those early indiscretions, convincing Elena that the gifts were innocent tokens of respect rather than attempts to influence his decisions. But Elena had resigned anyway, telling Marcus that she could no longer work for someone she didn't trust. She had left Washington entirely, taking a job with a legal aid clinic in New Mexico that served undocumented immigrants. Elena Rodriguez, Marcus whispered. She's been watching me all these years. Not just watching, protecting. Sarah slid another document across the table. Elena never stopped caring about the law, never stopped believing in justice. When she learned about your corruption, she could have exposed you immediately. Instead, she spent 3 years documenting everything, building a case that would be impossible to deny or dismiss. But why wait so long? Why let me continue making corrupted decisions? Because she was trying to save you. She kept hoping you would come to your senses, that you would find a way to stop before it was too late. Every piece of evidence she collected, every photograph she took, was meant to be leverage to convince you to confess voluntarily. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes for the first time since his arrest. Elena Rodriguez had been more than just a former clerk. She had been a moral compass, a reminder of what the law could be when practiced with integrity. The fact that she had been watching over him, trying to protect him even as she documented his fall, was almost too much to bear. She tried to warn you, Sarah continued. 3 times over the past 2 years, Elena attempted to reach out through intermediaries. Anonymous letters delivered to your chambers, voicemails left on your private line, even a meeting request sent through your secretary. You ignored them all. Marcus remembered the letters, the voicemails, the meeting requests. He had assumed they were from cranks or activists trying to lobby him improperly. He had instructed his staff to ignore all anonymous communications and to screen his calls more carefully. In his paranoia about being caught, he had blocked the very person who was trying to save him. When Elena realized you wouldn't listen to warnings, she made a different choice. She decided that if she couldn't save you from corruption, she could at least ensure that your fall served a greater purpose. That's when she approached Patricia Bondi. She gave the evidence to Patricia. She gave Patricia enough to start an investigation, but she held back the most damaging evidence. Elena wanted to control the timing and scope of your arrest, to maximize its impact on judicial reform. She wanted your fall to mean something beyond just another politician going to prison. Sarah handed Marcus one final document, a letter written in Elena's careful handwriting. Marcus recognized her script immediately, remembering how she used to leave detailed research memos on his desk each morning. But this letter was different, personal in a way that their professional relationship had never allowed. The letter began with an acknowledgement of disappointment. Justice Wellington, when I worked for you 12 years ago, you were my hero. You represented everything I believed the law could be: thoughtful, principled, committed to justice for all people, regardless of their wealth or status. Watching you fall into corruption has been the most painful experience of my professional life. But the letter didn't end with condemnation. Instead, Elena wrote about second chances, about the possibility of redemption even after the greatest failures. She described her work at the legal aid clinic, representing people who had been failed by the very system Marcus had once served. She wrote about clients who had been deported because of immigration decisions that favored enforcement over compassion, workers who had been cheated of wages because employment law protected employers over employees, families who had been torn apart because criminal justice policy prioritized punishment over rehabilitation. The law as it exists today serves power rather than justice, Elena wrote. Your corruption is a symptom of this larger problem, but your fall could be the beginning of something better. If you choose to learn from this experience, rather than simply endure it, you could become a voice for the people who have been forgotten by the system you once served. The letter concluded with an offer. When you are ready to rebuild your life, when you have accepted responsibility for what you have done and are prepared to dedicate yourself to something larger than your own redemption, contact me. I've been working on something that could use your unique perspective and experience. Not the perspective of a Supreme Court justice, but the perspective of someone who has seen how justice fails and is committed to doing better. Marcus read the letter 3 times before looking up at Sarah. She's offering me a way forward. She's offering you a chance to matter again, not as Justice Wellington, but as someone who understands both the power of law and its capacity for corruption. Someone who could help rebuild trust in institutions that people have stopped believing in. What kind of work is she doing? Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the detention center. She's building something new, a legal clinic that doesn't just represent individual clients, but works to change the systems that create injustice in the first place. Policy, advocacy, legislative reform, public education about how the law really works rather than how it's supposed to work. And she wants my help? She wants your experience, the good parts and the bad parts. She wants someone who has seen how justice can be corrupted so that they can help build safeguards against that corruption. She wants someone who has fallen as far as you have and is willing to climb back up by lifting others. That night, Marcus wrote a different kind of letter. Not an apology he would never send, but a response to Elena Rodriguez that he would send immediately. In it, he accepted full responsibility for his corruption, acknowledged the harm he had caused, and expressed his willingness to spend the rest of his life working to repair the damage he had done to the institution of justice. But more than that, he wrote about the possibility of transformation, about the idea that someone who had failed so completely could still find a way to serve the cause they had betrayed, about the hope that his experience of corruption could be turned into wisdom that might help prevent others from making the same choices. I don't deserve a second chance, Marcus wrote, but if you're willing to trust me with one, I promise to use it not for my own rehabilitation, but for the people who have been failed by the system we both once served. I want to learn from you, to understand how the law looks from the perspective of people who've been harmed by it, rather than empowered by it. Monica Williams delivered the letter the next day, along with Marcus's formal acceptance of the plea agreement. 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of serving his sentence at a minimum security facility that would allow him to continue his legal education and participate in prisoner advocacy programs. But the most important part of the plea agreement was a provision that Monica had negotiated in secret. Marcus would be allowed to work on legal research and writing projects during his incarceration, contributing to policy papers and reform. Proposals that would be published under Elena Rodriguez's name. He would spend his prison years not just serving his sentence, but building the expertise he would need to be useful when he was released. 2 weeks later, as Marcus was being transferred to federal prison in North Carolina, he received word that Patricia Bondi had been nominated for a position on the Federal Appeals Court. The nomination was controversial, with some arguing that her prosecution of Marcus had been politically motivated. But Marcus knew better. Patricia had done exactly what a prosecutor should do: follow the evidence wherever it led and hold the powerful accountable for their crimes. The prison where Marcus would spend the next 15 years was nothing like the federal detention center. It was surrounded by farmland rather than concrete, and the inmates were mostly white-collar criminals serving long sentences for financial crimes. Many of them had fallen from positions of power and influence, making Marcus's situation less unusual than it might have been elsewhere. His cellmate was a former bank president named David Kim, who had been convicted of embezzling pension funds. David had served 8 years of a 20-year sentence and had become something of an informal counselor to newly arrived inmates struggling with the transition from power to powerlessness. "The first year is the hardest," David told Marcus on his first night. "Not because of the conditions here, which are relatively comfortable, but because of the psychological adjustment. You spend every day remembering who you used to be and confronting who you've become. How do you get through it? By finding something to care about besides yourself. The guys who spend their whole sentences feeling sorry for themselves never really recover. The ones who find ways to be useful, to contribute something positive, they come out better than they went in." David was right about the psychological adjustment. Marcus spent his first months in a state of depression so deep that the prison psychiatrist recommended medication. He had lost not just his freedom and his career, but his entire sense of identity. For 40 years, he had been defined by his professional achievements, his intellectual abilities, his position in society. Without those external markers of worth, he felt like he was disappearing. The turning point came 4 months into his sentence when he received a package from Elena Rodriguez. It contained legal briefs from cases she was working on, along with a letter asking for his analysis and suggestions. The cases involved challenging immigration policies that separated families, employment practices that discriminated against formerly incarcerated individuals, and sentencing guidelines that disproportionately affected minority defendants. Reading Elena's briefs reminded Marcus why he had wanted to become a lawyer in the first place. Her arguments were brilliant, but more than that, they were motivated by a genuine commitment to justice for people who had been marginalized by the system. Working on her cases gave Marcus a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Over the following months, Marcus threw himself into legal research with an intensity that surprised both his fellow inmates and the prison staff. He spent 12 hours a day in the law library, reading case law, analyzing statutory language, and drafting memos that Elena could use in her advocacy work. The prison librarian, a former paralegal named Janet Morrison, became his closest collaborator, helping him access databases and legal resources that weren't typically available to inmates. "I've never seen anyone work as hard as you do," Janet told him after 6 months of collaboration. "Most inmates treat legal research like a hobby, something to pass the time. You treat it like it's the most important thing in the world, because it is," Marcus replied. "These cases matter. The people Elena is representing matter. If I can contribute something useful to their cause, then maybe my experience of corruption can serve a purpose beyond just punishment." The work was challenging in ways that Marcus hadn't expected. Elena's clients were nothing like the corporate executives and government officials who had typically appeared before the Supreme Court. They were undocumented immigrants facing deportation, minimum wage workers whose employers had stolen their pay, former prisoners struggling to find employment despite having served their sentences. Understanding their legal problems required Marcus to think about law from a perspective he had never considered during his years on the bench. The most difficult case involved a woman named Carmen Morales, whose husband had been deported despite having no criminal record beyond his undocumented status. Carmen was a U.S. citizen, but their 3 children were now effectively orphaned because she couldn't afford to support them alone, while also navigating the complex immigration system to try to bring her husband home. Marcus spent weeks researching immigration law, looking for any possible avenue of relief for Carmen's family. The legal barriers were enormous, created by statutes and court decisions that prioritized enforcement over family unity. But buried in the case law, Marcus found a narrow exception that might apply to Carmen's situation if it could be argued correctly. The brief Marcus wrote for Elena's use in Carmen's case was 60 pages long, meticulously researched and carefully reasoned. It argued that separating Carmen from her husband violated constitutional principles of family unity that had been recognized in other contexts. The argument was creative, but grounded in solid legal precedent, the kind of innovative thinking that had once made Marcus a respected jurist. Elena's response to the brief was immediate and enthusiastic. She called it the most thorough and persuasive legal analysis I've ever read on this issue, and asked Marcus to collaborate on similar briefs for other family separation cases. More importantly, she told him that federal courts in 3 different jurisdictions had cited his analysis in decisions that allowed families to remain together. "You're saving families," Elena wrote in her next letter. "Your research is directly contributing to keeping children with their parents, workers in their jobs, and communities together. This is what the law should be for helping people rather than punishing them." Reading Elena's letter, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his arrest: pride in his work. Not the ego-driven satisfaction of wielding power, but the deeper fulfillment that comes from using your skills to serve something larger than yourself. For the first time since his fall from grace, Marcus began to believe that his life might still have meaning beyond his failures. But the most profound change in Marcus's perspective came from his interactions with his fellow inmates. Many of them had been caught up in the same system of corruption that had destroyed his career. But, from the other side, they were the small-time offenders who had been prosecuted while more powerful criminals went free. The non-violent drug dealers who had received longer sentences than violent offenders. The financial crimes defendants who had been treated more harshly because they couldn't afford elite legal representation. Marcus's cellmate David had lost his pension, his home, and his marriage because of his embezzlement conviction. But David had also grown up in poverty, worked his way through college and business school, and had been supporting not just his own family, but his elderly parents and disabled brother when he made the decision to steal pension funds. The theft was still wrong, but understanding David's circumstances helped Marcus see how desperation could drive people to make choices they would never have considered under different circumstances. "I'm not making excuses for what I did," David told Marcus one evening as they discussed their respective cases, "but I also didn't have the safety net you had. When my family was facing eviction and my brother needed medical care, we couldn't afford. Stealing that money seemed like the only way to keep everyone safe. You had other options. You chose corruption because it was easier, not because you were desperate." David's words stung because they were true. Marcus had fallen into corruption gradually, seduced by luxury rather than driven by necessity. The other inmates he met had stories that were more complex, more sympathetic, more human than anything he had understood during his years on the bench. Their experiences taught him to see the criminal justice system from the perspective of those it was supposed to serve, rather than those who controlled it. As his first year in prison drew to a close, Marcus received a letter that would change the trajectory of his remaining sentence. Elena Rodriguez was expanding her legal clinic into a full-scale policy institute focused on criminal justice reform, immigration rights, and economic justice. She had received funding from several foundations and was assembling a team of lawyers, researchers, and advocates who had personal experience with the systems they were trying to change. I want to offer you a position as our senior research fellow in judicial ethics and corruption prevention, Elena wrote. Obviously, you would continue serving your sentence, but you would be able to work on projects that could have real impact, on preventing other judges from making the choices you made. The position would be unpaid, but your work would be published under your own name, and you would be credited as a full collaborator rather than an anonymous contributor. The offer represented something Marcus had never dared to hope for. A chance to rebuild his reputation, not by denying his failures, but by transforming them into wisdom that could benefit others. Working on judicial ethics reform would allow him to use his experience of corruption to help strengthen the safeguards that were supposed to prevent it. Marcus accepted Elena's offer immediately, and within a month, he was working on his first major project, a comprehensive analysis of the financial disclosure requirements for federal judges and the enforcement mechanisms designed to prevent conflicts of interest. The research required him to examine his own corruption in excruciating detail, identifying every point where existing safeguards had failed and proposing reforms that might prevent similar failures in the future. The work was emotionally exhausting, but intellectually satisfying in ways that Marcus hadn't experienced in years. He was using his legal training and his judicial experience to serve the cause of justice rather than his own interests. More importantly, he was doing it with complete transparency about his own failures, refusing to position himself as an expert on ethics while hiding his history of corruption. The report Marcus produced was 200 pages long and included detailed recommendations for reforming judicial financial disclosure requirements, strengthening enforcement mechanisms, and creating new safeguards against the kind of corruption that had destroyed his career. Elena published the report under both their names, with a foreword that explained Marcus's background and acknowledged his cooperation in the research. The response from the legal community was mixed, but largely positive. Some critics argued that a corrupt former judge shouldn't be given a platform to discuss judicial ethics, but others recognized the value of learning from someone who had experienced the system's failures firsthand. Federal judges began citing the report in their own ethics opinions, and several law schools incorporated it into their curricula on professional responsibility. But the most meaningful response came from ordinary people who had been affected by judicial corruption. Marcus received letters from attorneys who had practiced before corrupt judges, from litigants who had lost cases because of biased decisions, and from family members of defendants who had been sentenced unfairly. Many of the letters included thanks for his willingness to acknowledge his failures and work toward preventing similar corruption in the future. One letter particularly moved Marcus. It came from a young lawyer named James Thompson, whose client had been sentenced to 20 years in prison by a judge who was later convicted of taking bribes from prosecutors. James had spent 5 years trying to get his client's sentence reduced, but the appellate courts had been reluctant to overturn convictions even when the sentencing judge was proven corrupt. Your report gave me the legal framework I needed to argue for my client's resentencing, James wrote. The court cited your analysis of how judicial corruption affects the reliability of criminal convictions, and my client's sentence was reduced to 10 years. He'll be home with his family next year instead of in 2035. Thank you for turning your experience into something that could help someone else. Reading James's letter, Marcus felt a profound sense of redemption. Not redemption in the sense of earning forgiveness for his corruption, but redemption in the sense of finding a way to make his failures serve a constructive purpose. His work on judicial ethics wouldn't undo the harm he had caused, but it could help prevent similar harm in the future. As Marcus entered his second year of incarceration, he began to understand what Eleanor had meant when she wrote about transformation. He wasn't the same person who had been arrested in the Supreme Court 2 years earlier. Prison had stripped away his arrogance, his sense of entitlement, and his belief that his position made him different from the people who appeared before him in court. In its place, he had developed empathy, humility, and a genuine commitment to justice that went far beyond personal ambition. The man who would eventually leave federal prison would be fundamentally different from the corrupt judge who had entered it. But that transformation was still years away, and the most important chapters of Marcus's redemption had yet to be written. 10 years had passed since Marcus Wellington first walked through the gates of federal prison, and the man who emerged in the summer of 2034 bore little resemblance to the corrupt Supreme Court justice who had been arrested in open court. His hair had turned completely gray. Deep lines etched his face from years of contemplation and remorse, and his once proud bearing had been replaced by a quiet humility that came from genuine transformation rather than calculated performance. The world Marcus returned to was vastly different from the one he had left behind. The Supreme Court had undergone sweeping reforms following his arrest, implementing the very recommendations he had helped draft during his incarceration. Financial disclosure requirements had been strengthened, enforcement mechanisms had been created with real teeth, and a new ethics oversight board had been established to monitor judicial conduct. More importantly, public trust in the judicial system had begun to recover as reforms demonstrated that no one, regardless of position, was above accountability. Elena Rodriguez met Marcus at the prison gates on a humid August morning, driving the same battered Honda Civic she had used during law school 15 years earlier. She looked older, her dark hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes still held the fierce intelligence and unwavering commitment to justice that had made her such an exceptional clerk. The legal aid clinic she had built during Marcus's imprisonment had grown into the Rodriguez Institute for Justice Reform, a nationally recognized organization that combined direct legal services with policy advocacy and systemic reform efforts. The drive from the prison to the Institute's headquarters in Raleigh took 3 hours, during which Elena briefed Marcus on the changes that had occurred during his final years of incarceration. The organization now employed 47 attorneys, researchers and advocates across 6 offices in the Southeast. They had successfully challenged discriminatory sentencing practices in federal court, lobbied for immigration reform that prioritized family unity, and established prisoner re-entry programs in 12 states. But Elena's proudest achievement was the Judicial Accountability Project, a program that trained formerly incarcerated individuals to monitor court proceedings and identify potential ethical violations. The project had identified 17 cases of judicial misconduct in its first 2 years of operation, leading to investigations that resulted in 3 federal judges being censured and 1 being removed from the bench entirely. The people who have been through the system are often the best at spotting when it's not working properly, Elena explained as they drove through the rolling hills of North Carolina. They know what fair treatment looks like because they've experienced the alternative. Your research during your imprisonment helped us understand how to train them to document problems in ways that courts and ethics boards would take seriously. Marcus listened with a mixture of pride and amazement. His work during the past decade had contributed to reforms that were having real impact on real people's lives. The briefs he had written, the research he had conducted, and the policy proposals he had developed had become the foundation for systemic changes that went far beyond his individual case. The Rodriguez Institute's headquarters occupied a converted textile mill in downtown Raleigh, its brick walls and high ceilings, creating an atmosphere that was both professional and welcoming. The building buzzed with activity as attorneys prepared. For court appearances, researchers analyzed data on sentencing disparities, and advocates organized community education programs. Marcus felt a familiar excitement as he walked through the offices, the same feeling he had experienced as a young lawyer working on civil rights cases before ambition and compromise had led him astray. Elena's office was on the third floor, its windows overlooking the state capitol building, where many of the legislative battles for criminal justice reform were fought. The walls were covered with photographs of clients whose cases had resulted in policy changes, maps showing the locations of the Institute's various programs, and framed copies of court decisions that had cited the organization's research and advocacy. "I want to show you something," Elena said, pulling a thick binder from her bookshelf. "These are all the cases where your research made a difference. Every brief you wrote, every analysis you conducted, every recommendation you made. 347 families kept together, 218 wrongful convictions overturned, 61 policy changes implemented at the state and federal level." Marcus opened the binder and began reading through the case. Summaries? Each entry included a brief description of the legal issue, the research or analysis he had contributed, and the outcome of the case. Some involved high-profile policy changes that had received national media attention, while others were quiet victories for individual clients whose names would never be known outside their communities. One case involved a woman named Isabella Santos, whose husband had been deported despite having no criminal record, and 3 U.S. citizen children. Marcus's research had identified a previously unused provision of immigration law that allowed Isabella's family to remain together while pursuing permanent residency. Another case concerned a young man named Deshaun Williams, who had been sentenced to life in prison for a non-violent drug offense under mandatory minimum guidelines that Marcus's policy analysis had helped to reform. Isabella's youngest daughter graduated from high school last month, Elena said, watching Marcus read through the cases. She's starting college in the fall, planning to study immigration law so she can help other families like hers. Deshaun was released 3 years ago and now works as a peer counselor for people re-entering society after long prison sentences. As Marcus continued reading, he began to understand the full scope of what his work had accomplished. The research he had conducted in prison, motivated initially by guilt and a desire for personal redemption, had evolved into something much larger. His unique perspective as someone who had both wielded judicial power and experienced its abuse had allowed him to identify problems and solutions that others might have missed. But the most profound revelation came when Elena showed him a letter from Carmen Morales, the woman whose family separation case had been Marcus's first major research project during his imprisonment. Carmen had not only been reunited with her husband, but had become an advocate for immigration reform herself, working with the Rodriguez Institute to train other families facing deportation proceedings. "Your research didn't just save my family," Carmen had written. "It gave me the tools to help save other families. I've learned to read legal documents, to understand immigration law, to speak at community meetings about our rights. My children see me fighting for justice, and they're learning that even when the system fails you, you can still work to make it better." Elena closed the binder and looked directly at Marcus. This is what transformation looks like, not just changing yourself, but using your change to create opportunities for others to grow and fight and win. You've become something more valuable than you ever were as a Supreme Court justice. The truth of Elena's words settled over Marcus like a warm blanket. During his years on the highest court in the land, his decisions had affected thousands of people, but they had been made from a position of isolation and privilege that prevented him from truly understanding their impact. His work during imprisonment, and now his planned work with the Rodriguez Institute, would reach fewer people directly, but it would touch them more deeply because it came from genuine understanding rather than abstract legal reasoning. Elena offered Marcus a position as the Institute's Senior Fellow for Judicial Reform and Prisoner Advocacy, a role that would allow him to continue the research and policy work he had been doing during his incarceration, while also developing new programs based on his experience of the criminal justice system from the inside. The position came with a modest salary, enough to rent a small apartment and cover basic living expenses, but more importantly, it offered him the chance to spend his remaining years serving the cause he had betrayed during his time on the bench. Marcus accepted the position immediately, and within a week he had moved into a one-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from the Institute's headquarters. The apartment was spartanely furnished, containing only the essentials necessary for comfortable living. After years in a prison cell, the space felt luxurious despite its simplicity. But what struck Marcus most forcefully was the silence. For the first time in a decade, he could close his door and be completely alone with his thoughts, without the constant noise and supervision of institutional life. His first major project at the Rodriguez Institute involved developing a comprehensive re-entry program for formerly incarcerated individuals who had legal training or education. Marcus had met dozens of such people during his imprisonment, including disbarred attorneys, former judges, and law school graduates whose convictions had prevented them from practicing law. These individuals possessed valuable legal knowledge, but were largely excluded from the profession that had once defined their identities. The program Marcus designed, called Second Chances Legal Corps, would train formerly incarcerated individuals with legal backgrounds to work as paralegals and advocates for other people navigating the criminal justice system. Participants would receive certification in areas like prisoner rights, immigration law, and family court proceedings, allowing them to provide services that were desperately needed in underserved communities. The legal establishment's response to the program was predictably mixed. State bar associations raised concerns about allowing people with criminal convictions to work in legal settings, while law enforcement officials questioned whether former inmates could be trusted to advocate for current prisoners. But Marcus had anticipated these objections and had spent months building relationships with progressive prosecutors, reform-minded judges, and public defenders who understood the value of lived experience in legal advocacy. The program's first cohort included 12 participants, ranging from a former federal prosecutor who had been convicted of tax evasion to a disbarred immigration attorney who had served time for helping undocumented clients obtain false identification documents. Each participant brought unique skills and perspectives that traditional legal aid organizations often lacked. Marcus's favorite participant was a woman named Keisha Washington, who had graduated from law school but never taken the bar exam because she was convicted of drug possession while struggling with addiction during her final semester. Keisha had served 3 years in state prison, where she had become an informal legal advisor to other inmates, helping them file appeals, understand their rights, and navigate the complex procedures that governed prison life. "I know what it's like to have a public defender who's too overworked to return your calls," Keisha told Marcus during her first week in the program. "I know what it's like to sit in court and not understand what's happening to your life. I know what it's like to be treated like a case number instead of a human being. If I can use that knowledge to help someone else get better treatment, then maybe my experience means something." Under Marcus's supervision, Keisha began working with clients at the Institute who were facing criminal charges or dealing with the consequences of prior convictions. Her legal knowledge, combined with her personal experience of the system's failures, made her extraordinarily effective at connecting with clients and understanding their needs. Within 6 months, Keisha had helped 12 clients avoid incarceration through plea negotiations and diversion programs, and had assisted 15 others in obtaining employment despite their criminal records. The success of participants like Keisha attracted national attention to the Second Chances Legal Corps program. The American Bar Association, initially skeptical of the concept, published a report acknowledging that formerly incarcerated legal advocates often achieved better outcomes for their clients than traditional attorneys who lacked personal experience with the criminal justice system. 3 other states requested assistance in developing similar programs, and the U.S. Department of Justice provided funding to expand the initiative nationally. But Marcus's most important work during his first year out of prison involved a case that brought him face to face with the ongoing consequences of his own corruption. Jonathan Blackwell, the lobbyist who had bribed Marcus during his time on the Supreme Court, had continued his illegal activities for years after Marcus's arrest. Federal investigators had finally built a case against Jonathan that included charges of bribing 3 additional federal judges, laundering money through offshore accounts, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Patricia Bondi, now a federal appeals court judge, had been asked to consult on the prosecution's strategy because of her expertise in judicial corruption cases. When she learned that Marcus was working with the Rodriguez Institute, she reached out to Elena about the possibility of having Marcus assist with the investigation. Blackwell's operation was much larger than we understood when we prosecuted your case, Patricia explained during a conference call with Marcus and Elena. He had been bribing judges for over a decade, using the same methods he used with you, but targeting jurists who were vulnerable for different reasons. We need someone who understands how his system worked from the inside. Marcus felt a familiar chill as Patricia described the scope of Jonathan's corruption network. 7 federal judges had received payments over the past 15 years, resulting in dozens of corrupted decisions that had affected hundreds of cases. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Jonathan had specifically targeted judges who were facing financial pressures, family crises, or personal scandals that made them susceptible to compromise. He had a whole database of potential targets, Patricia continued. Judges going through expensive divorces, judges with children who needed medical treatment, judges who had made mistakes they wanted to keep secret. He researched their vulnerabilities and then approached them with offers that seemed like solutions to their problems. The description of Jonathan's methodology made Marcus sick to his stomach. He had always told himself that his corruption was an aberration, a unique combination of circumstances that had led him to make uncharacteristic choices. Learning that he had been selected as a target, that his mother's illness and his financial pressures had been identified and exploited by a calculating predator, forced him to confront the possibility that he had been a victim as well as a perpetrator. But Marcus also recognized that understanding Jonathan's methods could help prevent other judges from falling into similar traps. He agreed to cooperate with the investigation, providing detailed information about how Jonathan had approached him, what psychological techniques had been used to overcome his initial resistance, and how the payment system had been designed to avoid detection. The most difficult part of Marcus's cooperation involved testifying before a federal grand jury about his own corruption. Sitting in the witness chair under oath, describing his failures to a group of ordinary citizens who would decide whether to indict other judges, was one of the most humbling experiences of Marcus's life. But it was also strangely liberating. to tell the complete truth about what had happened to him, without the self-serving justifications and minimizations that had characterized his initial guilty plea. Marcus's testimony helped prosecutors understand how to approach the other judges who had been corrupted by Jonathan's network. Several of them had been too ashamed or frightened to cooperate initially, but Marcus's willingness to describe his own fall from grace encouraged them to tell their stories as well. The information they provided allowed investigators to identify additional victims and build cases against other participants in the corruption network. The investigation culminated in Jonathan Blackwell's arrest on a federal indictment that included 47 counts of bribery, conspiracy, and money laundering. The arrest took place in Jonathan's Washington office in front of the lobbyists and lawyers who had enabled his criminal enterprise for years. Marcus watched the news coverage from his apartment, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he saw the man who had corrupted him led away in handcuffs. But the most significant outcome of the investigation wasn't Jonathan's arrest. It was the comprehensive reform package that Congress passed in response to the revelations about judicial corruption. The legislation, known as the Judicial Integrity Act, implemented many of the recommendations that Marcus had developed during his imprisonment, including mandatory ethics training for all federal judges, regular financial audits of judicial accounts, and whistleblower protections for court employees who reported suspicious behavior. Marcus was invited to testify before the House Judiciary Committee during hearings on the legislation, marking his first public appearance since his release from prison. The hearing room was packed with reporters, legal scholars, and advocates who were curious to see how the disgraced former justice would handle the spotlight after years of working behind the scenes. Marcus's testimony was brief but powerful. He began by acknowledging the harm his corruption had caused and accepting full responsibility for his failures. But he spent most of his time describing the reforms that were needed to prevent other judges from making similar mistakes, drawing on both his experience as a judge and his research during imprisonment to explain how the current system's weaknesses could be addressed. Corruption doesn't happen overnight, Marcus told the committee. It's a process of gradual compromise, small concessions that seem harmless at first but create momentum toward larger violations. The reforms in this legislation would create multiple intervention points where judges who are beginning to drift could be redirected before they cross lines that destroy their careers and damage public trust in the courts. The most moving part of Marcus's testimony came when he was asked about the impact of his work with the Rodriguez Institute. Marcus described some of the families who had been kept together because of immigration reforms, the wrongfully convicted individuals who had been freed because of criminal justice changes, and the formerly incarcerated people who had found purpose and dignity through the Second Chances Legal Corps program. "I can't undo the harm I caused during my years of corruption," Marcus concluded. "But I can use my experience to help build systems that protect both judges and the people they serve from the kind of failures that destroyed my career. If my fall from grace can contribute to reforms that prevent other falls, then perhaps some good can come from even the worst mistakes." The Judicial Integrity Act passed both houses of Congress by overwhelming margins and was signed into law by the president 3 months later. Marcus attended the signing ceremony at Elena's invitation, standing in the back of the room as the president praised the bipartisan cooperation that had made the legislation possible. Several lawmakers mentioned Marcus's testimony and research in their remarks, acknowledging that his unique perspective had contributed to the strength of the final bill. But for Marcus, the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Carmen Morales, the woman whose family separation case had been his first research project in prison, had been invited to the ceremony because of her advocacy work on immigration reform. During a break in the proceedings, Carmen approached Marcus and introduced him to her teenage daughter, the same child whose family had been threatened with separation years earlier. "This is the man I told you about," Carmen said to her daughter in Spanish, then switching to English for Marcus's benefit. "His research helped keep our family together, and now he's helping change the system so other families won't have to go through what we did." Carmen's daughter, now 16 and fluent in both English and Spanish, looked at Marcus with curious eyes. "My mum says you used to be a judge but made mistakes and went to prison. Is that true?" Marcus smiled at the girl's directness. "Yes, it's true. I made very serious mistakes that hurt a lot of people, but I've been trying to make up for those mistakes by helping families like yours." "Are you a good person now?" the girl asked, with the moral clarity that only children possess. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I'm trying to be. Every day I try to do work that helps people instead of hurting them. I don't know if that makes me a good person, but I know it makes me a better person than I was before." The girl nodded seriously, then surprised Marcus by reaching out to shake his hand. "Thank you for helping my family, and thank you for trying to be better." The encounter with Carmen's daughter stayed with Marcus for weeks afterward. Her simple question about whether he was a good person forced him to confront the fundamental issue that had haunted him since his release from prison. Whether someone who had fallen as far as he had could ever truly redeem themselves, or whether the best they could hope for was to minimize the ongoing harm from their failures. Elena helped him work through these philosophical questions during their regular conversations about the Institute's work and Marcus's role in it. She pointed out that the question of whether Marcus was a good person was less important than the question of whether he was doing good work, the families who had been helped by his research, the policies that had been changed because of his advocacy, and the formerly incarcerated people who had found purpose through his programs didn't care about his moral status. They cared about the concrete improvements he had helped bring to their lives. "Redemption isn't a destination," Elena told him one evening as they worked late in the Institute's offices. "It's a process, a daily choice to use your knowledge and experience to serve something larger than yourself. You've been making that choice for 10 years now, and the results speak for themselves." As Marcus's second year out of prison began, the Rodriguez Institute announced its most ambitious project yet, the National Reentry Law Center, a program that would train formerly incarcerated individuals to become legal advocates in their own communities. The center would offer online courses, in-person training sessions, and certification programs that would allow graduates to work as paralegals, victim advocates, and community organizers. Marcus was asked to serve as the center's academic director, responsible for developing curriculum and training materials that would prepare formerly incarcerated people to navigate the legal system effectively. The work required him to synthesize everything he had learned about law during his career on the bench with everything he had learned about justice during his years in prison. The curriculum Marcus developed was unlike anything offered at traditional law schools. It combined technical legal knowledge with practical skills, like how to communicate with clients who had been traumatized by the criminal justice system, how to build trust with community members who were suspicious of legal institutions, and how to advocate for systemic changes while also addressing immediate individual needs. But the most innovative aspect of the curriculum was its emphasis on ethical decision-making and moral reasoning. Marcus required all students to study cases of legal professionals who'd been corrupted by power, money, or personal ambition. Not to shame them, but to understand how good people could make bad choices and how those choices could be prevented or corrected. Everyone who works in the legal system faces temptations and pressures that can lead them away from their core values, Marcus told the center's first cohort of students. The difference between people who maintain their integrity and people who lose it isn't that the first group faces fewer temptations. It's that they develop systems for recognizing and resisting those temptations before they become overwhelming. Marcus shared his own story with the students, describing his gradual slide into corruption and the rationalization that had allowed him to convince himself that his actions were justified. But he also described the process of rebuilding his moral foundation during his years in prison, the daily choices that had slowly restored his sense of purpose and integrity. The students responded to Marcus's honesty with their own stories of moral challenge and growth. Many of them had made mistakes that led to their incarceration, but they had also gained perspectives on justice and fairness that traditional legal education couldn't provide. Their discussions about ethics and advocacy were grounded in lived experience rather than abstract theory, making them more practical and more powerful than anything Marcus had encountered in academic settings. One student, a former gang member, named Miguel Santos, who had served 12 years for armed robbery, became particularly close to Marcus during the training program. Miguel had discovered his passion for legal advocacy while helping other inmates navigate the appeals process, and he had spent his final years in prison earning a bachelor's degree through correspondence courses. "I used to think the law was just another form of violence," Miguel told Marcus during one of their conversations. "Rich people used it to keep poor people down, and poor people got crushed by it, whether they followed the rules or not. But watching you work, seeing how you use your knowledge to help people fight back, I'm starting to understand that the law can be a tool for justice if the right people are holding it." Miguel's transformation during the training program was remarkable to witness. He had entered the program with deep cynicism about legal institutions and their capacity for fairness, but he gradually developed a sophisticated understanding of how law could be used to challenge injustice rather than perpetuate it. His final project involved developing a legal advocacy program for formerly incarcerated people in his hometown of Charlotte, focusing on helping them overcome barriers to employment, housing, and education. The success of students like Miguel attracted attention from legal aid organizations across the country, many of which began recruiting graduates of the National Reentry Law Center to work as community advocates and paralegals. Within 2 years, the center had trained over 200 formerly incarcerated people to work in legal advocacy roles, creating a network of advocates who understood the communities they served from the inside. But the center's most significant impact came through its influence on traditional legal education. Several law schools began incorporating the center's curriculum into their own programs, recognizing that students who had never experienced the criminal justice system as defendants or inmates often lacked the perspective necessary to represent marginalized clients effectively. Marcus was invited to speak at Harvard Law School, his own alma mater, about the integration of lived experience into legal education. Standing in the same classroom where he had first learned about constitutional law 30 years earlier, Marcus reflected on how his understanding of justice had evolved from abstract legal principles to concrete human realities. "When I was a student here, I thought justice was about applying rules fairly and consistently," Marcus told the current students. "I thought if judges followed proper procedures and legal precedents, justice would naturally result. What I learned during my years of corruption and imprisonment is that justice isn't automatic. It requires moral courage, genuine empathy, and the humility to recognize when our own perspectives are limited." Marcus described how his work with formerly incarcerated advocates had taught him that the communities most affected by legal decisions were often the least represented in legal institutions. Traditional legal education, with its emphasis on prestigious careers and high-paying jobs, tended to attract students who were far removed from the criminal justice system's impact on poor and marginalized communities. The students I work with now at the Reentry Law Center bring something to legal advocacy that can't be taught in classrooms, Marcus continued. They bring the knowledge that comes from having your own life affected by legal decisions, from understanding what it means to be on the receiving end of the justice system. If we want legal institutions to serve all communities fairly, we need advocates who come from all communities. The Harvard Law School speech generated significant media attention and sparked debates about diversity and representation in the legal profession. Marcus received invitations to speak at dozens of other law schools, bar associations, and legal conferences, sharing his perspective on how the profession could better serve marginalized communities. But the speaking engagements also brought Marcus face-to-face with critics who questioned whether someone with his history should be given a platform to discuss legal ethics and reform. During a particularly contentious panel discussion at the American Bar Association's annual conference, a federal prosecutor challenged Marcus's credibility directly. How can we trust someone who accepted bribes for 5 years to lecture us about integrity in the legal profession? The prosecutor asked. Doesn't giving a platform to corrupt former judges send the wrong message about accountability and consequences? Marcus had anticipated such challenges and had developed a response that acknowledged the validity of the criticism while explaining why his perspective remained valuable. You're absolutely right that I have no credibility when it comes to claiming moral authority, he replied. I forfeited that authority when I chose corruption over integrity, but I'm not here to claim moral authority. I'm here to share what I learned from losing it. Marcus went on to explain that his experience of corruption and its consequences had taught him things about judicial ethics that someone with a clean record might never understand. He knew what rationalization looked like from the inside, how small compromises could lead to larger ones, and what kinds of pressures and temptations were most dangerous for judges facing personal or financial difficulties. I can't tell you how to be ethical, Marcus concluded, but I can tell you what it looks like when ethics fail, how that failure happens, and what it costs everyone involved. If that knowledge can help prevent other judges from making the mistakes I made, then maybe some good can come from my failures. The prosecutor's challenge and Marcus's response became a defining moment in his rehabilitation in the eyes of the legal profession. Rather than claiming that his corruption was justified or minimizing its harm, Marcus had directly confronted his critics while explaining why his experience remained relevant to ongoing reform efforts. As Marcus entered his 3rd year out of prison, the Rodriguez Institute announced that it would be opening a new office in Washington, D.C. to focus on federal policy advocacy and judicial reform. Marcus was asked to serve as the office's director, a position that would put him at the center of ongoing efforts to strengthen judicial ethics and prevent corruption. The Washington office occupied a modest suite of rooms 6 blocks from the Capitol building, close enough to federal agencies and congressional offices to facilitate lobbying efforts, but far enough from the centers of power to maintain the Institute's outsider perspective. Marcus's office was small and spartanly furnished, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and bookshelves lined with legal treatises and policy reports. The view from Marcus's window looked out over the Supreme Court building, where he had once served and from which he had been led away in handcuffs 6 years earlier. The sight of the building's marble columns and grand staircase stirred complex emotions in Marcus, reminding him both of his highest achievements and his most devastating failures. But the view also served as a daily reminder of why his work mattered. Every morning as he arrived at the office, Marcus could see the line of visitors waiting to attend oral arguments. citizens who still believed in the promise of equal justice under law, despite the corruption scandals that had shaken their confidence in judicial institutions. His job was to help restore that confidence by building systems that would prevent future corruption, while also demonstrating that even fallen institutions could be reformed. Marcus's most challenging project in the Washington office involved working with congressional staff to develop oversight mechanisms for the federal judiciary. The Judicial Integrity Act had created new ethics requirements and reporting procedures, but enforcement remained largely in the hands of judges themselves. Through the Judicial Council system, Marcus argued that meaningful accountability required external oversight, including the possibility of congressional investigation and removal for serious ethical violations. The proposal was controversial within the legal establishment, with many judges and legal scholars arguing that congressional oversight would compromise judicial independence. But Marcus's experience had taught him that independence without accountability inevitably led to abuse, and that the judiciary's credibility depended on its willingness to police itself effectively. The debate over judicial oversight came to a head during congressional hearings on the reauthorization of judicial ethics funding. Marcus was invited to testify alongside current and former judges, legal scholars, and representatives from good government organizations. The hearing room was packed with reporters and advocacy groups, making it clear that the issue had captured significant public attention. Marcus's testimony focused on the practical challenges of implementing meaningful ethics enforcement within the current system. He described cases where judicial misconduct had been ignored or minimized by judicial councils reluctant to discipline their colleagues, and he explained how external oversight could provide accountability mechanisms that internal review processes had failed to deliver. Judicial independence is essential to our constitutional system, Marcus told the committee, but independence doesn't mean immunity from oversight. It means freedom from improper political influence, not freedom from accountability for ethical violations. The reforms we're discussing would strengthen judicial independence by restoring public confidence in the integrity of judicial decision-making. The hearing generated significant media coverage and helped build momentum for oversight reforms that had previously been considered politically impossible. 6 months later, Congress passed legislation creating an Inspector General for the federal judiciary, with authority to investigate ethical complaints and recommend disciplinary action. The legislation also established clear procedures for congressional removal of federal judges who engaged in serious misconduct. Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he watched the president sign the oversight legislation into law. The new systems wouldn't prevent all judicial corruption, but they would make it harder for judges to rationalize unethical behavior and easier for misconduct to be detected and addressed before it reached the level of criminality that had destroyed Marcus's career. But Marcus's most meaningful work during his time in Washington involved mentoring young lawyers and law students who were interested in careers in public service and legal reform. The Rodriguez Institute had established an internship program that brought students and recent graduates to work on policy advocacy and legal research, giving them exposure to the practical aspects of legal reform that weren't covered in traditional legal education. Marcus took particular interest in mentoring students who came from backgrounds similar to his own. Young people who had grown up with privilege and opportunities but were struggling to find ways to use their advantages to serve others rather than themselves. He shared his story not to discourage them from pursuing successful careers, but to help them understand the importance of maintaining their values even as they achieved professional success. One intern, a Harvard Law School student named David Chen, reminded Marcus of himself at the same age. David was brilliant, ambitious, and committed to social justice, but he was also attracted to the prestige and financial rewards that came with elite legal careers. During their weekly mentoring sessions, Marcus helped David think through the long-term implications of different career choices and the importance of building ethical foundations that could withstand future pressures and temptations. Success in the law isn't just about winning cases or getting prestigious appointments, Marcus told David during one of their conversations. It's about maintaining your integrity over the course of a long career, staying connected to the values that motivated you to study law in the first place, and using your skills to serve something larger than your own advancement. David absorbed these lessons eagerly, but Marcus also recognized the challenge of internalizing abstract ethical principles before facing real-world pressures and temptations. He encouraged David to develop concrete practices for maintaining his moral foundation, including regular self-reflection, seeking advice from trusted mentors, and maintaining connections to communities that would hold him accountable for his values. The mentoring relationships Marcus developed with interns and young lawyers became one of the most rewarding aspects of his work in Washington. He watched as former interns took jobs with legal aid organizations, public defender offices, and civil rights groups, carrying forward the commitment to justice and integrity that they had developed during their time at the Rodriguez Institute. But the most profound validation of Marcus's work came from an unexpected source. Carmen Morales' daughter, now a freshman at Georgetown Law School, applied for an internship with the Rodriguez Institute. In her application essay, she wrote about how Marcus's research had kept her family together and inspired her to pursue a career in immigration law. "I want to help other families the way Marcus Wellington helped mine," she wrote. Not because he was perfect, but because he learned from his mistakes and used that knowledge to serve others. "I believe the law can be a force for justice, but only if it's practiced by people who understand both its power and its potential for harm." Reading her application, Marcus felt a complete circle being drawn around his journey from corruption to redemption. The research he had conducted in a prison cell to make amends for his failures had not only helped Carmen's family stay together, but had also inspired the next generation of advocates who would continue the work of reform and justice. As Marcus prepared to conclude his testimony before yet another congressional committee, this time on the 5-year anniversary of the Judicial Integrity Act, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from the heights of judicial power to the depths of federal prison and finally to a position where he could contribute meaningfully to the cause of justice. The man who had once corrupted the highest court in the land had become an advocate for the very people his corruption had harmed. The former Supreme Court justice, who had sold his integrity for financial gain, had dedicated the remainder of his career to building systems that would prevent other judges from making similar choices. Standing in the committee hearing room, surrounded by the symbols of American democracy that he had once betrayed, Marcus understood that his transformation was complete, not because he had earned forgiveness for his failures, but because he had found a way to make those failures serve a constructive purpose. He had become living proof that even the worst mistakes could be transformed into wisdom, that even the most profound failures could become the foundation for meaningful service to others. The gavel had fallen on Marcus Wellington's career as a Supreme Court justice years ago in handcuffs and disgrace. But in the years since, he had helped build something more valuable than any judicial legacy, a network of advocates, reformers, and formerly incarcerated people who understood that justice was not something handed down from marble courts, but something built from the ground up by people who had experienced injustice and chosen to fight against it. As Marcus finished his testimony and prepared to return to his work, he carried with him the knowledge that his story was no longer just about his fall from grace. It had become a story about the possibility of transformation the power of second chances, and the extraordinary things that could happen when someone chose to use their worst failures as the foundation for their greatest contributions. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.